Back to our continuing coverage of the death of Fidel Castro. President Obama and President-elect Donald Trump have issued starkly different statements on Castro's death. Mr. Obama toes the diplomatic line, saying, quote, "History will record and judge the enormous impact of this singular figure on the people and the world around him." Mr. Trump, however, forgoes the traditional diplomatic niceties. Quote, "Fidel Castro's legacy is one of firing squads, theft, unimaginable suffering, poverty, and the denial of fundamental human rights." Let's bring in our fair and balanced panel. Former Romney presidential campaign advisor Brian Hook and Al Mater, who served on the Clinton campaign national finance team. Gentlemen, nice to see you. Al, for as much as Democrats might hope that Mr. Trump might moderate his views or his tone now that he is the president-elect, first major foreign policy issue since the election, and he is proving just as fiery.
Well, that's true, but I think, Leland, that his comment is perhaps more appropriate in light of who he's talking about. I mean, here we have someone who led communist Cuba for so many years, was an oppressive regime. There is an appropriate anger about a lot of the stuff that happened in Cuba.
If you're saying there's an appropriate anger, are you disappointed that that didn't come through in President Obama's statement?
I actually think that both of their statements reflect their personalities. You know, the president is trying to be subtle and nuanced and appeal to both Castro's supporters and opponents. He has a policy in place that he's trying to effectuate and move forward, whereas Trump's statement, more bombastic, yes, but he's trying to make his mark as the president-elect.
Ryan, this is President-elect Trump, and for that matter, when the president or president-elect of the United States speaks, they're not just speaking about the issue they're speaking about. They're speaking to the world. And whether it be Moscow or number 10 Downing Street or the South Koreans or the North Koreans, all just read what we're all reading from President-elect Trump. What's their reaction? How does this change things?
I think people are going to read Obama's statement and wonder why he whitewashed 60 years of history and why he didn't hold Castro accountable. He was a mass murderer responsible for the deaths of over 100,000 people. He was the closest the world ever came to a nuclear holocaust was the Cuban Missile Crisis.
Right, but then they read President-elect Trump's statement and they think to themselves, a new sheriff's in town?
I think so. And I think that Trump's statement is actually historically factual. It's an accurate statement of the Castro dictatorship. And I think that's going to resonate not only with Cuban exiles, but also the Cuban people, because it's much closer to reality than Obama's statement is.
And if we broaden this out a little bit, we're sort of playing the name game now in terms of who is going to lead the Trump administration in the various departments, probably the top pick of which is going to be Secretary of State, certainly as it relates to something like this. Brian, I know you work for Mitt Romney, somebody who is in contention for that, and now we see this very public feud playing out, if you will, sort of a Game of Thrones. A tweet from Kellyanne Conway, one of Trump's senior advisors, receiving deluge of social media and private comms re Romney. Some Trump loyalists warn against Romney as Secretary of State. First, we'll deal with the substance of this. Ryan, you still think Mr. Romney would make a good Secretary of State? If so, why?
I think he would make a very good Secretary of State. When he ran in 2012, he made a lot of predictions that have come true. He was right on Iraq. He was right on Syria. He was right on Russia. He was right on the growing threat of terrorism in West Africa. And I think any president would be well served to have somebody who's made the correct calls on foreign policy, even when they disagree. I think it's important for a president. I've worked for the president and for a Secretary of State. They need to have diverse viewpoints.
And Al, I'm guessing that based on the possible other options to Mr. Romney for Secretary of State, he'd probably be pretty acceptable, if you will, to Democrats.
I think that's right. I mean, you sort of got the good Trump and you've got the bad Trump, right? The good Trump thinks President Obama, Hillary Clinton are good people, thinks that perhaps there's some elements of the Paris Climate Accord and Obamacare that are worth preserving, and probably thinks Mitt Romney's a good Secretary of State. Bad Trump, maybe he picks somebody like Rudy Giuliani, who, in my opinion, jumped the shark during this campaign with his over-the-top attacks. So which one shows up, it remains to be seen.
Well, we will see, and perhaps he's the only one who knows. Al, Brian, great discussion, gentlemen. Thanks so much.
Great to be here.
Good to